literary legends and luminaries. Today we'll travel back into history with In the Houses of Their Dead, The Lincolns, the Booths, and the Spirits by Terry Alford. This book was not what I expected. First of all, I love historical books. I've always thought history, and whatever version of the truth is being presented, is more fascinating than any made-up story. I grew up in a household that valued history. Both of my parents were history buffs. The first time I remember falling in love with history was when I was a junior in high school during my American Studies class. American Studies was a 2-period class that combined American history with American literature, a combination I think should always exist in schools because it's so important to put the books we read into their historical context. But that's a topic for another show. That year, the whole junior class went to the auditorium to watch a John Wilkes Booth impersonator tell his story. It was absolutely fascinating. I don't remember too many of the details since it was so long ago, but he talked about the world of acting and his hatred for Lincoln, of course, and that fateful day in Ford Theater and his subsequent escape, at least for a few days. He was dressed in that coat with the chains showing, similarly to that popular picture of John Wilkes Booth that they always show. My mom loved the Civil War. I took a Civil War class in college. That is the most I learned of Lincoln. I read so much on the Kennedys that I can pinpoint variations in books and can readily discover bias and whatnot, but I don't have such knowledge about Abraham Lincoln. Last summer, I read a case study about Mary Lincoln and her mental illness and all that surrounded her after Lincoln was assassinated. I've always wanted to read more books about Lincoln, so I thought In the Houses of Their Dead would be an intriguing introduction to details that went beyond my Civil War class in college, especially the part about the spirits. I do believe in ghosts, just not the Amityville one. After my mom died, I saw a psychic. She had some uncanny details about my mom. She saw Scamp and Lady. Scamp was mom's little lap dog when she was a child, and Lady was her pony. She kept seeing a black and white dog, which was our family dog, Elsa. She talked about my mom having a really dry mouth toward the end. I don't know how she knew such things. I also attended a John Edwards event. He's a bit mean at times. Once he's singled out a person, don't you dare butt in. While I believe that much of it is a hoax, I think there is some truth to paranormal activity. And I knew that Lincoln had ominous dreams before he died. JFK had many premonitions about his death too. So this book screamed Julie in so many ways. And the book did not deliver in so many ways. In fact, despite so many fascinating events in this part of our history, it took me 2 weeks to read the book. Normally, I read a book in less than a week. It was not a page turner. I almost gave up on it about 50 pages in, but I thought it would get better. It didn't. I thought the book would mesh the Lincolns with the Booths and how their beliefs in the spirits would all sort of collide. Instead, I learned a ton about John Wilkes Booth's brother, Edwin, and the book should have been retitled The Lincolns, the Booths, and Adam Badeau, since so much of that information focused on him. And some Joseph Jefferson takes up a lot of space in the book too, but other than him being an actor, I have no idea why he was so important to the story. What a letdown. About the first 100 pages gives a reader Lincoln's background and John Wilkes Booth's background, but it's so confusing with all the names scattered about that don't always seem to connect to the book's theme, although I'm wondering if the problem with the book is the title. Yet, had it been titled something else, I probably wouldn't have bought it. What disappointed me the most was the dry writing style. I love history, yet this book sort of put me to sleep. It had a textbooky tone to it, and with all the names, some I was familiar with, some I wasn't, I understood why my students hate history, or school, or reading. That's how bad it was at times. If I could keep the names straight, which I could as the book progressed, Alford does provide interesting tidbits and passages, although I cannot say if these are new to the field of Lincoln or Booth, since I have not read much about them. Here's a passage about Booth and his reaction to the capture and subsequent hanging of some John Brown, who was an abolitionist. Slavery had been around for hundreds of years. What was new and unsettling to John was the sympathy for slaves in the North and rhetoric about them that threatened the nation's unity. Adding knives to word, Brown was the worst Yankee in the bunch. He was a freak and a fanatic, and yet John admired him. The old radical had lion-like courage and an indomitable will. He made the entire country stop and take notice of him and his cause. He fought his fight and stared at death with the grit of a dime novel hero. John believed one could be a murderer, as he labeled Brown, and also be the grandest character of this century. What that meant for the future can be imagined. So, yes, there's some good stuff in the book, but it's not what the title suggests. Obviously, in a book about Lincoln, we learn about the eccentric Mary Lincoln and the deaths of Willie and Tad. The ghostly world is dotted throughout the first half of the book, but nothing well developed or organized. Lincoln is just humoring his wife's interest in spiritualism and says to a confidant that it isn't real. Communications from the other world were delusions, he said. What I found most fascinating was how the Booths and the Lincolns crossed paths so many times before that fateful day in Ford Theater. Edwin Booth rescues Robert Lincoln from being run over by a train. John Wilkes refuses Lincoln's invite on more than one occasion because Lincoln was a fan of the theater and of John. But that's not spiritualism. Booth has multiple plots to kill Lincoln and attempts 3 times, which I vaguely remember from years ago. I'm assuming all this information that has been written about 1,000 times in other books about Lincoln and or the Booths. Alfred describes some popular mediums and seances of the time and writes about how some were complete frauds, but not always in connection to Lincoln. At points in the story, I had no idea really what the topic of the book was. And then suddenly, as I'm turning the pages, Booth assassinates Lincoln with little fanfare in the book. I understand that topic too has been written about to death, and Lincoln's assassination is not the focal point of the book. But it's a big deal. There's little build-up, even less focus on the spirits. There's over 50 pages left in the book, but with both Booth and Lincoln dead, that only leaves the spirits. Had Alfred not included everyone else in the story, he'd have nothing much to write about. It was fascinating to learn about Badu and his relationship with Grant and the writing of his memoirs, but what does that have to do with the Lincolns, the Booths, or the spirits? Nothing. Therein lies the problem. And when he does talk about the spirits, well, it's not that interesting, even though it should be very interesting. He includes this photo of Mary Lincoln, and you might be familiar with it before. And this ghostly figure is obviously Lincoln, and the mist over yonder is supposed to be Tad. And this is how Alfred describes the circumstances surrounding this photograph. Mary traveled to Boston in February 1872. Dressed in mourning black, a bonnet covered with black silk flowers, and a crepe veil, she called on William Mumler in the city's South End. He was the nation's most famous spirit photographer. Professing not to know who she was, Mumler seated her, prepared a plate, and exposed an image. Mumler had a controversial past, having had his own Colchester-style trial for fraud in New York City in 1869. Critics said his spirit photo was nothing more than double or combination printings of 2 photographic plates. Experts came up with 9 methods by which Mumler's shadows could be produced without supernatural help. Undaunted, the photographer moved to Boston and flourished, visited by Joseph Jefferson and Charles Foster, among others. Mary picked up her photo several days later after Mumler's wife, Hannah, a clairvoyant. The photograph showed a puffy-faced Mary seated in her widow's weed. Behind her was a clearly recognizable Lincoln, his hands on his wife's shoulders. The small white blob to his right was a boy, asserted Hannah. Tad? The mist behind them must be a third person. Willie? Mary studied the image closely. When Hannah asked her if she recognized the likeness, she hesitated. Hannah was instantly entranced. Turning to Mary, she said, "Mother, if you cannot recognize Father, show the picture to Robert. He will recognize it." "Yes, yes, dear," replied Mary. "I do recognize it. But who is now speaking?" The controlled reply was that he was Tad. Lincoln then took over Hannah and spoke to Mary for some time. "When my wife resumed her normal position," Mumler said, "she found Mrs. L. weeping tears of joy that she had again found her loved ones and apparently anxious to learn, if possible, how long before she could join them in their spirit home. The restless widow traveled on, avoiding family and friends and anyone else who might tell her no." What just happened? This is what's wrong with the book. Alfred throws in these passages with the spirits and then just moves on. 1/3 of the subtitle is the spirits, yet it's not really developed. What did those around Mary think of this photograph? What about Mumler? What is the spiritual photography that was apparently popular at the time? This is how the whole book is written. So very frustrating. If you want to learn about mediums and spiritualism in Lincoln's time, sure, you'll get some pieces here and there in the Houses of Their Dead, but you're going to have to weed through a ton of other information to find what little details there are. It's probably not worth it. If you know a lot about Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth, I doubt this book will give you anything new. If you don't know much about Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth, this book is probably not a good starting point. I had such high hopes for this book. I love paranormal stuff, even if it's a hoax. I love reading about people who are searching for answers from beyond the grave. Lincoln lost 2 little boys, and Mary was not the typical straight-laced wife. To seek some sort of answers or comfort in the likes of seances doesn't seem that far-fetched. Spiritualism was trendy at the time in Lincoln's life, so it makes sense that the White House would partake in such activities. I've read enough about the Kennedys to know that their White House parties were the hot social ticket of the time. Yet Alfred doesn't pull much of this information together at all. It's scattered, sporadic, and filled with way too many tangential people that don't figure much into the spiritual aspect of the book or connect with Lincoln or Booth, as the subtitle of the book suggests. Yes, I learned stuff from the book simply because it was a historical book about subjects I hadn't read a ton of information about before. It may have enticed me to read more about John Wilkes Booth and Abraham Lincoln, so maybe it wasn't all a loss, even though I wouldn't recommend spending the money or the time reading this particular book. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.